Here's a question I want you to sit with before this video begins, and I want you to actually think about it, not just read it and move on. How many hours have you spent practicing English? Go ahead, add it up. The classes, the apps, the repetition exercises, the vocabulary lists, the grammar drills, the YouTube videos, the podcasts you listen to while doing dishes or ride on the bus, the flashcards, the conversation partners you tried to find, the speaking challenges you signed up for and then quietly abandoned 3 days in, the notebooks filled with phrases you thought you would eventually use, the late nights going over pronunciation guides, the mornings spent shadowing native speakers, mimicking their mouth movements, trying to sound exactly like them. Add all of it up. For most of you, that number is somewhere between 500 and 5,000 hours. Some of you have been studying English for over a decade. Some of you grew up in classrooms where English was taught every single year from childhood through university. Some of you have certificates. Some of you have passed international exams. Some of you can read English articles with near-perfect comprehension, write emails that your native-speaking colleagues respect, and understand almost every word of a fast-paced American television show. And yet, you open your mouth in a real conversation and something happens. Something goes wrong. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in that quiet, suffocating way that only you can feel. The words slow down, the sentences lose their shape. The thought that was perfectly formed inside your mind becomes a broken, stumbling thing the moment it has to leave your lips. And you stand there in that conversation, watching yourself fail at something you have practiced for years. My question for you, and I want you to find the answer in this video, and then I want you to write it in the comments below, is this. What is the one thing that practice cannot give you, but that fluent speakers have in abundance? Find that answer. Write it below when you do, because by the end of this video, you will know exactly what it is, and more importantly, you will know how to get it. Before we go further, if you have never been to this channel before, this is the Speaking Reset. We do not teach English here. We rebuild it. There is a difference, and you are about to understand exactly what that difference means. If this kind of content is what you have been looking for, content that goes deeper than tips and tricks, then subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss what we put out. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Practice Trap. There is a lie in the language learning world. It is a well-meaning lie told by teachers and textbooks and motivational posts and popular YouTube channels and language learning apps with their cute little streaks and reward sounds. The lie is simple. The lie is this: if you want to speak better, you need to practice more. It sounds true. It feels true. It has the shape and weight of truth. And because it sounds true and feels true, millions of people accept it without examination. They go home from their English class and they practice more. They download another app and they practice more. They find a speaking partner and they practice more. They shadow native speakers and they practice more. And some of them, after months or years of this, do improve. They get better at doing the thing they practiced. Their grammar becomes more accurate. Their vocabulary grows. Their pronunciation smooths out. But something strange happens. Something that nobody in the language learning industry wants to talk about too directly. Because talking about it honestly would require dismantling an enormous amount of what they have built. The practice stops translating into real speaking. At a certain point, and this point is different for different people, but it arrives for almost everyone. Practicing more stops making you meaningfully better at actual, spontaneous, unscripted conversation. You hit a ceiling, not a grammar ceiling, not a vocabulary ceiling, something else. Something harder to name, harder to see, harder to explain to your teacher or your speaking partner or yourself. You know the feeling. You have been inside it. You are probably inside it right now, which is why you clicked on this video. Here's what I want to tell you. The ceiling you have hit is not a skill ceiling. It is not a knowledge ceiling. It is not even a practice ceiling. It is something fundamentally different. And until you understand what it is, more practice will not help you break through it. More practice will only press you harder against it. Think about what the word practice actually means. When you practice something, you are doing a version of the real thing in a controlled environment. A basketball player practices free throws in an empty gym. A surgeon practices procedures on simulation models. A musician practices a piece in a quiet room with no audience. Practice is deliberately separated from the full pressure of the real performance. That is the entire point of practice. You reduce the stakes so that you can repeat the mechanics safely until they become automatic. Now here's the problem with applying this model to language. Language, real language, the kind that happens between two human beings in a live moment, is not a performance. It is not a sport. It is not a surgery. It is something categorically different. It is a living exchange of meaning between two minds happening in real time, shaped by emotion, shaped by relationship, shaped by context, shaped by history, shaped by things happening in the environment around the conversation, shaped by who you believe yourself to be in that moment, shaped by how safe or unsafe you feel, shaped by what is at stake, shaped by how much you care about what the other person thinks of you. You cannot practice that in a controlled environment. You can simulate pieces of it. You can get more comfortable with certain phrases, certain patterns, certain sounds, but you cannot practice the full, living, breathing reality of conversation. Because the moment you try to practice it, it is no longer conversation. It is rehearsal. And rehearsal and conversation operate on completely different neurological frequencies. This is what nobody tells you when they hand you a list of speaking exercises. Every speaking exercise, no matter how well designed, is rehearsal. It is you doing a controlled version of the real thing. And rehearsal makes you better at rehearsal. It makes you better at performing in controlled conditions. It does not automatically translate into the ability to speak freely, spontaneously, and confidently in the wild unpredictability of an actual human exchange. This is not a criticism of practice. Practice has its place. Drilling vocabulary helps you remember words. Working on pronunciation helps you shape sounds correctly. Repeating grammar patterns helps those patterns become more accessible. These are all real benefits, but they are benefits with a ceiling, and the ceiling is not one you can break through with more of the same. Let me give you a picture that might help. Imagine you want to learn to swim. You spend 6 months in a classroom learning about water. You study the physics of buoyancy. You memorize the mechanics of the freestyle stroke. You watch hundreds of hours of video of expert swimmers. You practice the arm movements while standing on dry land. You get in a shallow pool and do drills. You become very good at the drills. Your form is technically excellent. And then someone drops you in the deep end of a pool. What happens? You panic. Your technically excellent form disappears. Your carefully rehearsed strokes become desperate splashing. Your body forgets everything your mind thought it knew. And you are not drowning because you did not practice enough. You are struggling because the thing you practiced, the controlled, safe, low-stakes version of swimming, did not prepare you for the full sensory and emotional reality of being in deep water with no floor beneath your feet. Real conversation is deep water. And most language learners have been training in the shallow end for years, wondering why they cannot swim when it counts. The practice trap is this: practice feels like progress, even when it is not moving you toward where you need to go. Practice feels productive. Practice feels safe. Practice feels like effort, and effort feels like it should lead somewhere. So you keep practicing because stopping feels like giving up. Practicing more feels like the responsible, disciplined thing to do. And all the while, the gap between what you can do in practice and what you can do in real conversation stays exactly the same size, or gets wider. You are not lazy. You are not untalented. You are not bad at languages. You are trapped. You are trapped in a system that keeps rewarding the wrong behavior with the feeling of progress. And today, we're going to break you out of that system, not by giving you better practice methods, but by showing you what you need to develop instead of practicing more. The shift is not about doing more. It is about doing something fundamentally different. And it starts by understanding what your brain is actually doing when you try to speak. Let me give you one more angle on the practice trap before we move on, because I want to make sure you have seen it from every side. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and once you cannot unsee it, the way you approach language development changes permanently. Think about the people you know personally, not famous polyglots, not professional linguists, just people in your life who speak a second or third language with genuine natural fluency. People who live inside the language. People who joke in it, dream in it, argue in it, fall in love in it. When you think about how those people got there, what do you picture? In most cases, it was not an accelerated course. It was not 1,000 hours of shadowing exercises. It was not an app with a perfect streak. It was immersion. They lived somewhere. They worked somewhere. They were in a relationship with someone. They were dropped into a context where the language was the only option, and they had no choice but to find their way inside it. They made mistakes. They were confused. They were embarrassed. They repeated themselves 100 times and asked for clarification 100 more. And over time, through all of that uncomfortable, unscripted, high-stakes use, the language became theirs. This is not an argument for moving to an English-speaking country, though that helps. It is an argument for understanding what the actual mechanism of deep fluency acquisition is. The mechanism is not repetition in controlled conditions. The mechanism is engagement in authentic conditions. Real stakes, real confusion, real connection, real failure followed by real recovery. Real emotional investment in what is being communicated. You can create this without moving countries. You can create it in how you read, in how you listen, in how you choose to engage with English content, in the kinds of conversations you seek out or create, in the internal life you decide to live in the language. You cannot create it with flashcards and drills, no matter how perfectly designed those drills are. The conditions are fundamentally wrong, and using the wrong conditions, no matter how diligently and consistently, will not produce the outcome that requires the right conditions. There is also a subtle psychological damage that extended drilling can do, which most people never identify. When you drill for long enough, when you spend years doing controlled language exercises with measurable, graded outcomes, you begin to experience language performance as something that can and should be evaluated against a standard of correctness. You internalize the grader. The teacher who marks your answers right or wrong becomes a voice inside your head, running alongside every sentence you produce in conversation, checking it for errors, rating its quality, comparing it to the correct version. This internalized grader is one of the most destructive forces in a language learner's development because conversation cannot survive constant internal grading. Conversation requires presence. It requires the capacity to be genuinely with another person in a moment of real exchange. And the internal grader pulls you out of that presence, back into the classroom, back into performance mode, back into the experience of being evaluated, rather than the experience of communicating. How many conversations have you had where you said less than you wanted to say, or said something simpler than what you actually meant? Because the internal grader told you that the more complex or complete thing you wanted to express had too high a risk of coming out wrong. How many times have you chosen the safe sentence over the true sentence because the true sentence was linguistically beyond your grader-approved comfort zone? Every time you do that, you are letting the practice trap win. You are allowing the classroom to colonize your conversation, and the result is conversations that feel hollow, that do not fully represent you, that leave both you and the other person with a sense that something real almost happened, but did not quite make it through. The way out is not to study harder. The way out is to dissolve the internal grader, to return to the raw, honest act of trying to say what you actually mean, to the best of your current ability, without the judge sitting on your shoulder. This is not about lowering standards. It is about relocating them. Standards for accuracy belong in reflection and in writing and in deliberate revision. They do not belong in the middle of a living conversation. You are not lazy. You are not untalented. You are not bad at languages. And you are not failing because you have not practiced enough. You are struggling because the method is wrong for the goal. Let us now go deeper into exactly why, by understanding what your brain is actually doing when it tries to produce a second language under pressure. Chapter 2. What your brain is actually doing. When you practice, your brain is not a muscle. I know you have heard that phrase. Treat your brain like a muscle, exercise it, and it will grow stronger. There is some truth to that metaphor, but it is also dangerously incomplete. Because if you treat your brain exactly like a muscle, you will train it the wrong way and wonder why you are not getting the results you want. Here is a more accurate picture of what your brain is actually doing when you learn a language, and more importantly, when you try to use a language in real time. Your brain is a prediction machine. This is not a metaphor. This is what neuroscientists and cognitive scientists increasingly understand about how the brain works at a fundamental level. Your brain is constantly, continuously, and at incredible speed, running predictions about what is happening and what is about to happen. Every perception you have, every word you hear, every sentence you process, your brain is predicting forward, filling in gaps, completing patterns before the input even arrives. This is why you can read sentences with jumbled or missing letters and still understand them. This is why you can hear someone speaking in a noisy environment and still follow along even when you physically cannot hear every word. Your brain is not passively receiving language. It is actively constructing it, predicting it, filling it in based on patterns it has learned to recognize. Now, here is what this means for language learning. When you practice English using drills, exercises, flashcards, and repetition, you are feeding your brain patterns. You are teaching it to recognize certain sequences, certain structures, certain combinations of sounds and meanings. And this is valuable. Your brain becomes better at recognizing and completing those patterns. But, and this is critical, There is a difference between your brain being good at recognizing patterns in controlled conditions and your brain being good at generating language spontaneously under social pressure. When you are in a real conversation, your brain is not just doing language, it is doing everything at once. It is monitoring the other person's face for emotional signals. It is tracking what has already been said to maintain coherence. It is predicting what the other person is about to say next. It is managing your own emotional state, your nervousness, your self-consciousness, your fear of saying something wrong, your desire to be understood, your concern about how you sound. It is searching your memory for relevant vocabulary. It is running grammar patterns in the background. It is managing the physical production of speech, the breath, the mouth movements, the timing. It is doing all of this simultaneously, in real time, with a human being in front of you waiting for a response. That is an enormous cognitive load. And when the cognitive load becomes too high, when your brain is managing too many things at once, something has to give. What usually gives first is the language production. The fluency breaks down. The words slow down or stop entirely. The sentence structure collapses. You reach for a simple phrase and forget it. You know the word in your native language and cannot find it in English. Your mouth opens and nothing comes out, or what comes out is not what you meant to say. This experience has a name. Researchers call it cognitive overload. You have probably experienced it thousands of times in English conversations. That feeling of your mind going blank, of reaching for something and finding nothing, of knowing you know the word but simply being unable to access it. That is cognitive overload. That is your brain failing to manage too many competing demands at once. Here is the key insight. Practice as most learners do, it does not reduce cognitive load in real conversations. It reduces cognitive load in practice sessions. In a drill, you are not managing social pressure, emotional self-monitoring, real-time unpredictability, or the physical and emotional weight of being judged by another person. So your brain has plenty of capacity to produce language accurately and confidently. But the moment those other factors enter, the moment it becomes real, the cognitive load spikes and your language production collapses right back to where it was. There is another thing happening in your brain that makes this even more complicated. Your brain has two different systems for processing and producing language, and they operate in very different ways. The first system is what researchers sometimes call the explicit learning system. This is the deliberate, conscious, rule-based part of your brain. This is the part that remembers grammar rules. This is the part that knows that the past tense of go is went and not goed. This is the part that learned vocabulary from flashcards and remembers that albeit means although. This is the analytical system, the thinking system, the system that works well when you have time to think. The second system is what researchers call the implicit learning system. This is the intuitive, automatic, pattern-based part of your brain. This is the system that native speakers use when they speak. This is not the system that knows the rules of language. This is the system that has internalized language so deeply that it does not need the rules anymore. A native English speaker does not think about whether to use have been or was. The correct form simply arrives. The explicit system, the rules, has become so deeply absorbed that it operates invisibly below conscious awareness. Here is the trap that most language learners fall into. Most practice methods, grammar drills, vocabulary exercises, structured conversation practice, develop the explicit system. They make you better at consciously applying rules. But in real conversation, there is no time to consciously apply rules. Real conversation happens at a speed that the explicit system cannot match. By the time your explicit system has checked whether to use the past perfect or the simple past, the moment has already passed and the conversation has moved on without you. Fluent speakers do not use their explicit system during conversation. They use it during reflection, during writing, during careful, deliberate communication. During actual conversation, they use the implicit system, the automatic system, the part of the brain that has absorbed language so completely that it no longer needs to think about it. The shift you need to make is not just about practicing more patterns. It is about learning how to move knowledge from your explicit system into your implicit system. It is about learning how to absorb language rather than just learn it. And that process is completely different from what most language learners are doing. It is slower in some ways, it is faster in others. But most importantly, it actually works. It builds the kind of fluency that holds up under pressure. Because it is not built on conscious rules. It is built on something much deeper. We're going to get into exactly how to do this in the later chapters of this video. But before we get there, we need to understand one more critical thing: the difference between drilling and actually speaking. Because until you see that difference clearly, you will keep confusing one for the other. Chapter 3. The difference between drilling and speaking. If you ask most English teachers what you should do to improve your speaking, they will tell you to practice speaking. And they will give you speaking exercises. They will tell you to do shadowing, listen to a native speaker, and repeat what they say immediately, matching their rhythm and intonation. They will tell you to do dictation. They will tell you to do role plays. They will tell you to record yourself and listen back. They will tell you to practice common conversational phrases until they feel natural. They will give you scripts and dialogues and structured prompts. These are drilling methods. They have value. They are not useless, but they are drilling. And drilling is not speaking. Let me tell you what speaking actually is, because I think most people have forgotten, or perhaps never really understood, what the experience of genuine speaking requires. Speaking is the act of converting a thought into sound in real time. That sounds simple. It is not. Let us break it down piece by piece. First, there is the thought. Before you can speak, you have to have something to say. This sounds obvious, but it is actually where a lot of learners lose themselves without realizing it. When you do a drilling exercise, the thought is given to you. The exercise tells you what to say. You are translating a prompt into a sentence or repeating a phrase after a model. You are not generating the thought. You are packaging a pre-provided thought into pre-practiced language. In real speaking, you are generating the thought yourself. You are deciding in real time what you want to communicate, and this generation process is deeply tied to your identity, your emotional state, your relationship with the person you are speaking to, your sense of safety, and your sense of self. When these things are stable, when you feel safe, when you feel confident, when you feel like yourself, thought generation is easy. When they are destabilized, when you feel anxious, when you feel judged, when you feel like you might say something wrong, thought generation becomes incredibly difficult. Your mind goes blank not because you have nothing to say, but because the internal conditions for generating thought have collapsed. Second, there is the conversion process. Once you have a thought, you have to convert it into language. In your native language, this is entirely automatic. You do not think about how to convert the thought. It converts itself at a speed that keeps pace with the thought itself. In a second language, particularly one that you learned through explicit study rather than natural immersion, this conversion process can be slow, effortful, and error-prone. And the effort it takes slows everything down, which creates awkward pauses, which creates self-consciousness, which destabilizes the internal conditions for thought generation, which makes the conversion even harder. It is a downward spiral that almost every intermediate learner knows intimately. Third, there is the delivery. Once the thought has been converted into language, it has to actually come out of your mouth in a way that is intelligible, appropriately paced, correctly stressed, and emotionally congruent with what you are trying to communicate. This requires breath control, mouth muscle coordination, rhythm, timing, and a kind of physical confidence that takes years to develop in a non-native tongue. And again, none of this can be practiced in isolation from the first two steps and then expected to function automatically when all three happen at once. Drilling addresses the second step, the conversion process, in isolation. Drilling gives you prepackaged conversational formulas that you have rehearsed until they come out quickly. And yes, having a bank of well-rehearsed phrases is useful. It reduces the burden on the conversion process for common situations, but it does not help with thought generation under pressure. It does not help with the collapse of internal conditions that happens when you feel unsafe or judged. It does not help with the integration of all three steps happening simultaneously in the context of a real, unpredictable, emotionally loaded exchange. There is another dimension of speaking that drilling completely misses, and it might be the most important one of all. Speaking is relational. Real speaking is not a solo performance. It is a co-creation. You and the person you are speaking with are building something together in real time. You are reading each other's signals, adjusting to each other's energy, responding to what is actually being communicated rather than just the literal words being said. You are navigating misunderstanding, clarifying meaning, taking turns, managing the flow of the conversation, handling unexpected tangents, recovering from moments of confusion, and doing all of this with another human being whose responses you cannot predict or control. Drilling cannot prepare you for this, because drilling has no real other person in it. Even when you practice with a speaking partner, if the session is structured as a drill, if you are following a script, completing a task, filling in a template, you are not genuinely engaging in relational communication. You are doing a simulation, a safe, structured, low-stakes simulation that does not carry the full weight of the real thing. Let me take this even further, because there is a layer of this that is almost never discussed, and yet it matters enormously. There is an emotional dimension to real speaking that no exercise can replicate, and that emotional dimension is not a peripheral feature of communication, like decoration on a cake. It is the foundation. It is the substance. It is what makes communication real, rather than mechanical. When you speak in real life, you are not just conveying information. You are revealing yourself. Every sentence you say in a real conversation is a small act of exposure. You are showing the other person how you think, what you know, what you believe, how you feel, who you are at this particular moment. And that exposure carries risk. The risk of being misunderstood, the risk of being judged, the risk of saying something wrong not just grammatically, but interpersonally, saying something that damages the relationship, that makes the other person like you less, that makes them think less of your intelligence or your character. Exercises do not carry this risk. When you do a speaking exercise, even with a real practice partner, both parties understand that this is practice. The social stakes are explicitly lowered. Mistakes are expected. Imperfection is acceptable. The relational dimension of the exchange is bracketed. And because that risk is absent, the exercise cannot prepare you for the experience of carrying it. Think about what happens to an actor who has rehearsed a scene perfectly in the green room, delivering every line with precision and emotional truth in the low-stakes safety of rehearsal. And then the curtain rises, and the audience is there. Real people, watching, judging, ready to respond. And the actor walks on stage and delivers the first line. Everything that happens in that moment, the slight shift in the voice, the subtle increase in heart rate, the heightened awareness of every gesture and expression, is the reality of performance landing on the reality of rehearsal. And even the most experienced, most prepared actor feels it. Now imagine you are not an experienced actor. You are someone who has been rehearsing in the green room for years, but who has barely ever been on stage. The curtain rises, and the gap between rehearsal and performance is not a subtle shift, it is a chasm. Everything that works smoothly in the green room becomes uncertain in the light of a real audience. This is the experience of the language learner in a high-stakes conversation. And more rehearsal in the green room does not close that chasm. Only more time on stage does. Here is the difficult implication of everything we have just explored. If drilling is not speaking, and if the skills developed through drilling do not automatically transfer to real speaking, then the only way to develop real speaking ability is to speak, really speak, not in simulated conditions, but in the actual, messy, risky, unpredictable, emotionally real conditions of genuine communication. This means accepting that you will speak imperfectly, that you will freeze sometimes, that you will say things wrong, that you will be misunderstood, that conversations will sometimes end awkwardly, with both parties knowing that the communication did not fully land. These experiences are not setbacks. They are the training. They are the only training that actually prepares you for more of the same. Every uncomfortable real conversation you have and survive, without giving up, without retreating into silence, without vowing to study more before you try again, deposits something into your speaking account that no amount of drilling ever could. It deposits real experience, real evidence that you can be in the discomfort and come out the other side, real neural updating based on real conditions, real growth. This is not a reason to stop drilling entirely. Drill. Use exercises. Study grammar. Expand vocabulary. Shadow speakers. Do all of it. But do it knowing that none of it is speaking. None of it is real. And hold alongside all of it a commitment to also doing the real thing. The uncomfortable, uncontrolled, genuinely risky real thing. As often and as bravely as you can. How do you develop your capacity to generate thought under pressure? How do you develop the relational attunement that real conversation requires? How do you reduce the cognitive load of real speaking without reducing the reality of the speaking itself? These are the right questions, and they point toward a very different set of practices than most language learners are currently engaged in. Practices that feel less like language study and more like something else entirely. Something closer to inner work. Something closer to rebuilding your relationship with yourself and with the act of communication. Because here's the truth that the language learning industry does not want you to sit with too long. The reason most people cannot speak fluently under pressure is not a language problem. It is a human problem. It is a problem of fear, of identity, of self-trust, of the relationship between who you are and what language you are trying to use to express who you are. And until you address that problem directly, not metaphorically, not motivationally, but practically and specifically, more practice will not save you. Chapter 4. Why you freeze in real conversations. Let us talk about the freeze. You know exactly what I mean. That moment in a conversation when your mind goes completely, terrifyingly blank. When someone asks you a question that you know the answer to, and suddenly you cannot find a single word. When you are in the middle of a sentence and the next word simply disappears. When you are at a meeting, or a job interview, or a social gathering, or a phone call, and you feel a wave of something wash over you, something that is not quite panic but is related to it, and your English, which you have been studying for years, becomes completely inaccessible. People who have never experienced this think it is a vocabulary problem. They think you freeze because you do not know the words. But you know that is not true. You know that 5 minutes later, alone in the elevator or in your car on the way home, those words come back effortlessly. You think of 10 different ways you could have said what you wanted to say. You replay the conversation in your head and you speak it perfectly. In your head, alone, with no one watching. So it is not a vocabulary problem. It is not a knowledge problem. It is something else. And understanding what that something else is might be the single most important thing you do in your language learning journey. The freeze is a threat response. Your brain has an ancient automatic system designed to protect you from danger. You have probably heard of it described as fight, flight, or freeze. When your brain detects a threat, a real threat, like a predator, or a social threat, like the possibility of public humiliation or rejection, it activates the system. And when it activates, cognitive resources get redistributed. Blood moves to the parts of the body that deal with physical threat. The thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for complex language processing, goes partially offline. Your survival systems take over. Now here is the crucial thing. Your brain cannot always tell the difference between a physical threat and a social threat. Evolution gave us the threat response system for surviving predators and violence, but it applies the same system to social situations that trigger fear. A job interview, a conversation with someone important, a moment when you feel like you might embarrass yourself, a situation where you believe that making a mistake in English will cause others to judge you, to think less of you, to see you as less intelligent or less capable or less educated than you are. In those moments, your brain fires the threat response, and the threat response shuts down the very neural systems you need to produce fluid, spontaneous language. This is why the best predictor of whether you can speak English well in a given moment is not how much English you have studied. It is how safe you feel in that moment. People who feel psychologically safe speak better. People who feel threatened speak worse. This is not weakness. This is basic human neurology. And this is why more practice, more drilling, more exercises, more repetition does not solve the freeze. Practice happens in safe conditions. Your brain is not under threat during practice, so your language production works fine during practice. But when the threat response fires in a real conversation, practice-based skills become inaccessible. They are stored in a part of your brain that the threat response has temporarily shut down. What you actually need, and what almost no language course teaches, is the ability to regulate your threat response, to recognize when your brain is interpreting a conversation as a threat, and to actively calm it down enough to restore access to your language abilities. This is a skill. It can be developed, but it is not a language skill in the traditional sense. It is a nervous system skill. a self-regulation skill, a skill that lives at the intersection of psychology and language learning. There is a secondary layer to the freeze that is equally important to understand. It involves something called social evaluation threat. This is the specific fear of being judged negatively by others. Researchers have found that social evaluation threat is one of the most cognitively disruptive threats a human brain can experience. More disruptive in terms of its effect on cognitive performance than many physical threats. The prospect of being seen as stupid, as incompetent, as foreign, as less than. This is one of the most powerful cognitive disruptors known to neuroscience. For non-native speakers, particularly those who are highly educated and competent in their native language, speaking in a second language creates an automatic social evaluation threat. Because you know, even if no one has ever said it, that your second language self sounds less intelligent than your first language self. You can be a surgeon, a professor, an engineer, a philosopher in your native tongue, and in English you sound like a child trying to explain something complicated with a limited set of words. That gap, the gap between who you know you are and who you sound like in English, is a source of profound social evaluation threat. And that threat fires the threat response, and the threat response shuts down your language production, and you freeze. Here is the pattern playing out in real time in millions of conversations happening right now around the world. Someone walks into a meeting where the discussion is in English. They are brilliant. They have something important to contribute. But the moment they open their mouth, they hear their own accent. They stumble over a word. They lose the grammatical structure of a long sentence. And the threat response fires. And suddenly, they are not thinking about what they wanted to say. They are thinking about how they sound. They are monitoring themselves, judging themselves, trying to manage how they are perceived. And all of that monitoring and judging is using exactly the cognitive resources that they need for language production. So they get quieter, or they fall back on simple, safe phrases that do not fully express what they mean, or they freeze entirely, and then they go home and decide they need more practice. They do not need more practice. They need to understand the actual mechanism of the freeze so they can interrupt it. They need to develop the capacity to restore internal safety quickly in high-stakes situations. They need to learn to trust their own mind rather than fight it. And they need to address something even deeper than all of that, something that goes all the way down to the foundation of how they see themselves in relation to the English language. Let me give you something practical before we move into identity, because I want every chapter of this video to leave you with something you can actually use, not just something you can understand intellectually. The freeze is a neurological event. It is your threat response system activating in response to a perceived social danger. And because it is neurological, because it runs on the hardware of the body, not just the software of the mind, you can interrupt it with physical signals. You can speak to the body's alarm system in the body's language. Here is what this looks like. The next time you feel the freeze beginning, that rising tightness in the chest, that sudden blankness in the mind, that awful awareness of your own voice as something foreign, do not try to think your way out of it. Thinking harder will not help. Reaching for the word more desperately will not help. Apologizing, internally or externally, will not help. Instead, breathe. Specifically, extend your exhale. Breathe in for 4 counts. Breathe out for 6 or 7. Do this once or twice. This is not a relaxation technique in the vague self-help sense. This is a direct neurological intervention. Extending the exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the system that counteracts the threat response. It sends a physiological signal to your brain that says, the threat is not as severe as I thought. I can come back online. I can think. Second, slow down. Not because slowing down gives you more time to find the word, though it does, but because slowing down changes your body's assessment of the urgency of the situation. The threat response is, among other things, a speed response, fast heart rate, fast breathing, fast scanning, darting attention. When you deliberately slow your speech, even just slightly, you are again sending a signal to the threat system that says, this is manageable. I do not need to run. I can stay. Third, name what is happening, at least internally. I am nervous right now. I am struggling to find the word. I am feeling the freeze. This kind of internal narration, what psychologists call labeling, has a well-documented calming effect on the threat response. It activates the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, which is exactly the part of the brain that the threat response shuts down. The act of putting words to your internal experience literally turns the thinking brain back on. None of these techniques are magic. None of them will eliminate the freeze forever. But they are real, evidence-based interventions that reduce the intensity and duration of the freeze when it happens. And the more you practice them, in low-stakes situations first, then in progressively higher-stakes ones, the more your nervous system learns that English conversations are not actually life-threatening. The threat response recalibrates. Its hair trigger sensitivity gradually eases, and the freeze becomes less frequent, less severe, and less catastrophic when it does occur. They need to work on their identity. Chapter 5. The Identity Problem. Nobody talks about you have two selves, maybe more. But for the purpose of this conversation, let us talk about two. There is the self you are in your native language. This self is fully formed. This self has a voice, a real voice with personality, with humor, with depth, with authority, with warmth or sharpness or both. This self can hold a room. This self can argue a point, or tell a story, or comfort someone in pain, or explain a complex idea with the right words at the right moment. This self has been developing since you were born. It is layered, nuanced, specific, and real. And then there's the self you are in English. This self is younger, simpler, less confident, less fully formed. This self stumbles over words that the other self uses effortlessly. This self cannot always find the right way to be funny, because humor is deeply linguistic, and the English self has not yet developed the same linguistic agility. This self speaks more slowly, more carefully, with more gaps and more self-monitoring. This self sometimes cannot say what it means. This self knows things, but cannot always express knowing them. This self is, in some ways, a lesser version of the real self, and most learners, even very advanced learners, have not resolved the tension between these two selves. They have not integrated their English self into their full identity. The English self remains a performance, a role they put on, a costume they wear in certain situations. And because it is a performance rather than an authentic identity, it is fragile. It collapses under pressure. It cannot sustain itself in the unscripted, unpredictable, emotionally authentic conditions of real conversation. This is the identity problem, and it is the deepest layer of the speaking problem, deeper than grammar, deeper than vocabulary, deeper than pronunciation, deeper even than cognitive load. If your English self is not a real self, if it is a performance you put on rather than an authentic expression of who you are, it will always break down when the stakes are high enough. Think about how identity affects performance in other areas of life. An athlete who is afraid to win at the level of identity, who does not see herself as someone who wins, will find a way to lose even when she is physically capable of winning. A person who at the level of identity believes they are bad at public speaking will produce a performance consistent with that belief, even if they have technically rehearsed the speech perfectly. A person who believes at the level of identity that they are likable will walk into social situations and naturally draw people in, while a person who believes at the level of identity that they are awkward will walk into the same situations and confirm that belief, even though the social environment is identical. Identity is a self-fulfilling prophecy. What you believe about who you are shapes how you act, which produces results that confirm the belief, which deepens the identity, which strengthens the belief. This is not mysticism. This is basic behavioral science. Now, here is the specific identity problem that most non-native English speakers are carrying without fully realizing it. Somewhere in the history of learning English, in the classroom where you made mistakes and got corrected in front of others, or in the conversation where a native speaker looked confused when you spoke, or in the moment when you read something in English and felt stupid because the vocabulary was beyond you, or in the meeting where someone talked over you because your speaking pace made them impatient, you formed a belief, a quiet belief, maybe not even a conscious one, a belief that sounds something like this: I am not a natural English speaker. English is not really mine. When I speak English, I am always going to be an outsider looking in, borrowing a language that belongs to someone else, doing my best to approximate something that will always sound a little bit wrong, a little bit foreign, a little bit less than the real thing. You may not say this to yourself in those words, but the behavior that flows from this belief is very specific and very recognizable. It is the hesitation before speaking. It is the apology at the beginning of the sentence. I'm sorry, my English is not perfect. It is the translation from your native language rather than the attempt to think directly in English. It is the deference to native speakers as the authority on whether your English is correct rather than your own judgment. It is the constant self-monitoring, the constant self-correction, the constant background awareness that you are using someone else's language, and they can always tell. This belief, this identity, is the deepest source of your speaking problems, and it cannot be fixed by practicing more sentences. It cannot be drilled away. It cannot be fixed by studying harder, or finding a better speaking partner, or shadowing more native speakers. It is an identity belief, and identity beliefs change through identity work. Let me sit with this identity belief a little longer before we get into what to do about it, because I want you to really recognize it in yourself, not as a concept, as a personal truth, as something you have been carrying. The identity belief I described, I am not a natural English speaker, English is not really mine, is not just a belief about language. It is a belief about belonging, and belonging is one of the deepest human needs. The need to feel that you have a legitimate place in the social world, that your presence is appropriate and welcome, that you have a right to occupy the space you are in. When that need is threatened, when you feel like an outsider in a conversation, when you feel like you do not have the right tools to fully participate, the psychological experience is more painful than most people admit. For many highly educated, professionally accomplished non-native speakers, English is the one arena in their life where they feel consistently less than. And because this feeling is attached to something as fundamental as communication, as the ability to express who you are, it bleeds into every area of English use. It makes phone calls feel daunting. It makes meetings feel exhausting. It makes social situations in English feel like performances rather than genuine connection. It makes the language, rather than being a bridge to other people, feel like a wall that reminds you of what you cannot fully access. And then, and this is the cruelest part of the cycle, the language anxiety itself confirms the identity belief. You feel like an outsider, so you struggle. You struggle, so your language performance suffers. Your language performance suffers, so the people around you get less of you than you actually are, and you leave the interaction feeling once again like the limited, insufficient English-speaking version of yourself, rather than the complete, capable, fully formed person you know yourself to be in your native tongue. This cycle is not inevitable. It is not permanent. It is a pattern, and patterns can be interrupted. But they cannot be interrupted at the level of the pattern itself. They have to be interrupted at the level of the belief that generates the pattern. And the belief is the identity belief. The belief that says, this language is not mine. I am a visitor here. Interrupting that belief requires evidence. Real evidence, accumulated through real experience. That contradicts the belief at the level of felt reality, rather than just intellectual agreement. You can agree with the idea that English is yours. You can nod along to the argument that every language you know belongs to you, that there is no owner of a language, that anyone who uses English has as much right to it as any other speaker. You can agree with all of that and still feel, in the live moment of a difficult conversation, like an imposter. Because identity does not change through intellectual agreement alone. It changes through repeated experience, through small, accumulated moments of speaking and being heard and surviving and continuing, through conversations that go better than expected, through moments of genuine connection in English, through the experience of making someone laugh in this language, or comforting someone, or explaining something clearly, or changing someone's mind. Through all of these, slowly, a new body of evidence builds, a new story accumulates, and gradually, the identity belief, I am a visitor in this language, loses its monopoly on your sense of self. A new belief begins to take hold, a belief that sounds something like, this language is not perfect in my mouth, but it is genuinely mine. I have built something real here, and I belong inside it. What does identity work look like in the context of language learning? It starts with a reframing that sounds simple but carries enormous weight. English is not a foreign language you borrowed. English is a language you built. Every word you know, you learned. Every structure you can use, you mastered. Every moment of comprehension you have had in English was a moment of real cognition happening in a real mind. Your mind. English is not outside of you. It is in you. It is part of you. And the version of you that speaks English is not a lesser version of who you are. It is a different expression of the same person. This is not affirmation poster talk. This is a cognitive reframe that has real neurological implications. When you shift the narrative from, I am borrowing their language, to, this language is part of who I am, you shift the relationship between your English self and your core identity. And when that relationship shifts, the fragility of the English self starts to resolve. It becomes less of a performance and more of an authentic mode of expression. We're going to go much deeper into this reframe and into how to actually internalize it rather than just intellectually agree with it. But first, we need to understand something about how fluent speakers think, because understanding their internal experience is one of the most powerful tools you have for reshaping your own. Chapter 6. How to Rewire Your English Mind. Let me tell you something that will frustrate you at first, and then, if you let it, will be one of the most useful things anyone has ever said to you about learning to speak English. You cannot become fluent by thinking about English. You become fluent by thinking in English. There is a wall between these two things. Thinking about English means using your brain to analyze, study, understand, and practice the language as an external object. Thinking in English means using the language as a tool for thought itself, the same way you think in your native language, with no translation layer, no analysis layer, no "is this correct" checking layer sitting between the thought and the expression. Most language learners, including many advanced ones, are stuck on the wrong side of that wall. They think about English. They use English as an object of study rather than a medium of thought. And because of this, there is always a lag between what they want to say and what they actually say. The lag is the translation, the analysis, the checking, the moment of going, "Now let me find the English word for this thing I am thinking, and make sure the grammar is right, and make sure it sounds natural, and okay, now I can say it." Native speakers do not have this lag. Their thoughts and their language are unified. Thought and word arrive simultaneously. There is no translation because there is no native language to translate from. Or rather, the native language does not function as the home base to which all thinking returns. Thinking and language are the same process. For you to become truly fluent, not technically proficient, but genuinely fluid, you need to cross that wall. You need to rewire your relationship to English so that it becomes a medium of thought rather than an object of study. How do you do this? It begins with a practice that most people resist because it feels uncomfortable and imprecise and like you are doing it wrong. Start thinking in English, not speaking English, not writing English, not practicing English, thinking. Internal monologue. The stream of thought that runs through your mind from morning to evening. Let it run in English. This will feel wrong at first. It will feel broken and slow and insufficient. Your English internal monologue will be simpler than your native language internal monologue. You will not have all the words you need. You will leave gaps. You will think half in your native language and half in English. This is fine. This is not a mistake. This is exactly what the beginning of the transition looks like. But here is what happens when you persist with it. Over time, not weeks, but months, your English internal monologue starts to become richer. It starts to expand into areas of your thinking that it has never occupied before. New vocabulary starts to feel natural, not because you drilled it, but because you needed it to think about something and found it. Grammatical structures start to feel inevitable rather than chosen, because the thought demanded that structure and the structure came. And then something remarkable starts to happen in your external conversations. The lag starts to shorten. The translation starts to disappear. You say something and you are not sure where it came from. It just came. The thought and the English arrived together. For a moment, you were not a language learner. You were a person speaking. That moment is what you are working toward. And it comes not from more drilling, but from this inside-out shift, from making English the home of your thoughts rather than the translation of your thoughts. There is a second element of rewiring your English mind that is equally important, and it has to do with the quality of the English you are consuming. Not the quantity, the quality. Most language learners are consuming English that is designed for language learners. They are watching YouTube videos that speak slowly and clearly with simple vocabulary. They are listening to podcasts that use carefully chosen, accessible language. They are reading articles that are deliberately simple. And there is a place for this, particularly in early stages. But at the intermediate and advanced level, Staying with simplified English is like a runner who only ever trains on a flat surface and then enters a race with hills. The conditions are not the same and the body is not prepared. The English that fluent speakers actually use in real conversation, the rhythm, the speed, the idioms, the incomplete sentences, the overlapping speech, the wordplay, the cultural references, the use of tone and implication rather than literal statement. This is very different from the English you encounter in most language learning materials. And if you have been exclusively consuming simplified English, your brain has not been exposed to the full range of the language as it actually operates in the wild. You need to consume authentic, unfiltered English, not just as a listening exercise, but as an immersive experience, without subtitles, without pausing to look up words, just listening, letting your brain absorb patterns even when it does not consciously understand every word. This is how your implicit system gets fed. It gets fed by massive exposure to real language in real context, not by careful study of simplified language in controlled conditions. There's a third element of rewiring that is perhaps the most counterintuitive. It involves letting yourself be wrong, not as a learning exercise, not as a conscious technique, but as a way of being, as a position you hold about yourself in relation to English. One of the biggest energy leaks in a non-native speaker's cognitive system is the ongoing background process of monitoring for errors. This process runs constantly, using up cognitive resources that could be used for language generation. Every time you say something in English, a part of your brain is reviewing what you just said, checking it for errors, rating its quality, comparing it to an imagined correct version. This is exhausting. And more than that, it is actively counterproductive because it diverts processing power away from the thing you are actually trying to do. Rewiring means deliberately turning that monitoring process down. It means making a conscious decision, and then a habit, and then eventually a default state, to let the language come without immediately judging what comes, to say the imperfect thing and let it be imperfect and keep moving, to trust that communication is happening even when the form is not flawless, to value being understood over being correct. This is not giving up on accuracy. Accuracy still matters, but accuracy is something you work on in reflection when you are not in the middle of a conversation. During the conversation itself, your job is not to be accurate. Your job is to communicate. And communication does not require perfection. It requires enough. The paradox is that when you stop monitoring so aggressively for errors, you actually make fewer of them, because the cognitive resources that were going into monitoring can now go into language generation. And the language generation that is not anxiously monitored tends to be more natural, more fluid, and in many cases more accurate than language production that is constantly being second-guessed. There is a specific technique for rebuilding your relationship with mistakes that I want to share with you, because understanding it conceptually is not enough. You need a practical way to apply it. The technique is what I call the 3-second rule. Every time you say something in English and immediately want to correct yourself, judge yourself, apologize for yourself, or replay the mistake in your mind, you get 3 seconds. 3 seconds to acknowledge what happened, and then you continue. You do not dwell. You do not spiral. You do not let the mistake become the story of the conversation. You give yourself 3 seconds, and then you move forward. This is harder than it sounds, because the impulse to dwell on mistakes is powerful and feels responsible, like paying attention to quality control. But what it is actually doing is derailing your presence in the conversation. Every second you spend on the last mistake is a second you are not in the current moment. You are living in the past, replaying something you cannot change, while the living conversation moves on without your full presence. 3 seconds. Acknowledge. Continue. Over time, this practice does 2 things. First, it gradually reduces the emotional charge of individual mistakes. The more often you acknowledge and move on, the more your nervous system learns that mistakes are survivable events, not crises. The threat response associated with making a mistake begins to recalibrate. Mistakes stop feeling like emergencies. Second, it keeps you in the conversation, staying present, staying engaged, staying connected to the actual human exchange happening in front of you. This is where the real learning lives. This is where your brain gets the real-time feedback that drives genuine improvement. There is also a longer-term practice for your relationship with mistakes that is equally important. At the end of each day, or at the end of each significant English language experience, take 5 minutes to do what I call a mistake harvest. Go through any mistakes you noticed. Things you said that you know were incorrect, words you could not find, structures that came out wrong. Write them down, not as a list of failures, but as a list of discoveries. These are the places where your map of the language does not yet match the territory. And then, and this is the critical step, look up the correct form, or the word you could not find, or the structure that confused you, not during the conversation, after, in quiet reflection. This is when the explicit system should be doing its correcting work, not in the middle of the living exchange. When you do the mistake harvest regularly, something remarkable happens over time. The same mistakes stop appearing on the list, not because you are drilling them, because the process of harvesting, of noticing, accepting, and quietly correcting gradually updates the map. Your brain, which is always running its prediction model of the language, takes the correction and integrates it. And eventually the wrong form stops being the first thing that comes, because the updated map redirects to the right form automatically. This is deeply different from the experience of being corrected in the moment by a teacher or a speaking partner. In the moment correction, while sometimes useful, often amplifies the social evaluation threat. It flags the mistake publicly, which fires the threat response, which interferes with integration. Quiet, reflective, private correction, done in a context of self-compassion and genuine curiosity rather than self-judgment, goes much deeper. It lands in a neurologically receptive state rather than a neurologically defensive one. Build a new relationship with your mistakes, not a permissive relationship, not one that says it does not matter and you can be careless. A clear-eyed, compassionate, curious relationship. One that says, I see you, mistake. You are information. You are the map updating itself. You are progress in its most honest form. And I am not afraid of you. When you stop being afraid of mistakes, you start making more of them, because you start taking more risks. You start attempting more complex sentences, reaching for more precise vocabulary, pushing into the edges of your current ability, rather than staying safely within it. And at the edges is exactly where growth happens. At the edges is where your implicit system gets the material it needs to expand the map. At the edges is where the language starts to feel like yours. This is the paradox of learning. The fastest path to fewer mistakes runs directly through the willingness to make more of them. Chapter 7. Fluency is not a skill, it is a state. There is something that advanced language learners often say that gives away exactly where they are stuck. They say something like this: I am working on becoming more fluent. I am trying to improve my fluency. My fluency is getting better. Fluency as a destination. Fluency as a thing you acquire and then have. Fluency as a level you reach on a scale, like going from intermediate to upper intermediate to advanced. This conception of fluency is fundamentally incorrect. And because it is incorrect, it leads to incorrect strategies for pursuing it. Fluency is not a skill. Fluency is a state. It is a state of being in which language flows freely, automatically, and without conscious effort. And like all states, it is not constant. It varies based on conditions. You are more fluent in some moments and less fluent in others. You are more fluent when you feel safe, relaxed, and engaged. You are less fluent when you feel threatened, anxious, or self-conscious. You are more fluent when you have slept well, when you are physically comfortable, when you are talking about something you know well and care about. You are less fluent when you are exhausted, nervous, out of your depth, or talking to someone whose judgment you fear. This variability is not evidence that your English is getting worse. It is evidence that fluency is a state, not a possession. And understanding this changes everything about how you approach the goal. Think about how native speakers experience fluency variability. Every native speaker in the world has conversations where they stumble, where they lose their words, where they say something wrong or unclear or incomplete. Public speakers have moments where they blank on a word. Writers search for sentences that will not come. Professors lose their train of thought mid-lecture. Lovers fail to find the right words at the most important moment. This is not because they have forgotten how to speak their native language. It is because the state of fluency was disrupted by conditions, by nervousness, by emotion, by the particular weight of the moment. The difference between native speakers and most non-native speakers is not that native speakers always have access to perfect fluency. It is that they have a higher baseline. Their floor is higher. Even in difficult conditions, their fluency does not collapse as far or as fast as a non-native speaker's tends to. And this is because their relationship to the language is more deeply rooted. It is more embedded in their identity. It has more redundancy, more pathways to the same words, the same structures, the same meanings. So even when one pathway is blocked by stress or fatigue or social pressure, other pathways remain open. What you are building when you are developing as a speaker is not a skill. You are building a deeper, more embedded, more redundant relationship with the language. You are building more pathways. You are raising your floor. You are expanding the range of conditions under which your natural fluency state can maintain itself. This shift in framing from building a skill to building a state has practical implications for how you train. If fluency is a state, then the training question is not only how do I get better at English, but also how do I create and maintain the internal conditions under which my best English naturally emerges. Those conditions are not mysterious. They are learnable, practicable, and developable. They include the physiological state of the body, how rested, how grounded, how regulated the nervous system is. They include the psychological state, the sense of safety, the absence of excessive self-judgment, the presence of genuine engagement with what is being communicated. They include the relational state, the feeling of connection with the person you are speaking to, the sense of being received rather than evaluated, the experience of communication as collaboration rather than performance. When these conditions are present, your best English emerges naturally, not because you suddenly know more words or have better grammar, but because the state of fluency can actualize. The knowledge you already have becomes accessible. The structures you have learned become available. The voice you have been developing gets a chance to come through. I want to give you a very specific and practical application of this idea, because the concept of fluency as a state is only useful to you if you can translate it into something you actually do differently. If fluency is a state that depends on conditions, then your job includes actively managing those conditions before, during, and after conversations. Most learners put all their energy into before. They study before. They prepare before. They try to load themselves up with vocabulary and phrases and grammar points before. And then they enter the conversation under-resourced in exactly the things that matter most in the moment: nervous system regulation, psychological safety, genuine engagement. Before a conversation, particularly a high-stakes one, the most valuable preparation is not reviewing vocabulary. It is preparing your state. This means asking yourself, what internal conditions do I need in order to access my best English? And then actively creating those conditions. For most people, this involves some combination of physical grounding, which means a few minutes of deliberate slow breathing to regulate the nervous system; mental priming, which means reminding yourself of conversations you have had in English that went well, bringing those memories forward so that the evidence of your own capability is fresh in your mind; and emotional orientation, which means deliberately shifting your intention from performing correctly to connecting genuinely. That last one is particularly powerful. When you walk into a conversation with the intention to perform correctly, you trigger evaluation anxiety. When you walk into a conversation with the intention to genuinely connect, to actually engage with this person, to really hear what they are saying, to be truly present, the social evaluation threat drops, and the fluency state has more room to emerge. During a conversation, managing your state means keeping a small part of your awareness on your own internal experience. Not as self-monitoring, not as grading your language, but as a kind of gentle internal weather check. Am I still regulated? Is the threat response rising? Is my breathing getting shallow? If you notice the signals of the threat response starting to activate, the rising tension, the narrowing of attention, the search for escape, you have options. You can breathe consciously. You can slow your speech. You can redirect your attention to the other person, letting their face and their words pull you out of your own head and back into the conversation. You can buy yourself a moment with a simple phrase, "That's an interesting point. Let me think about that for a second." Native speakers do this constantly. They use these little bridges to give themselves time to organize their thoughts. You are allowed to use them too. After a conversation, managing your state means how you debrief with yourself. Most anxious language learners leave difficult conversations and immediately replay every mistake in their mind, every stumbled word, every frozen moment, every sentence that came out wrong. They turn the conversation over and over, looking for evidence of failure. This debriefing process confirms and deepens the negative identity belief, which makes the next conversation harder. It is the most counterproductive thing you can do after a difficult exchange. A different debriefing process looks like this. You ask yourself, what actually happened in that conversation? What did I communicate successfully? What moments of real connection or understanding were there? What did the other person receive from me, even if it was not perfectly expressed? And then, separately, not as the main event but as a secondary review, what one thing could I do differently next time? Not a list of everything that went wrong. One thing. And then you close the debrief. You close it intentionally. You do not leave it open as a wound. Your job, and this is a significant reframe from how most learners think about their job, is not primarily to add more English to your brain. Your job is to create more conditions under which the English already in your brain can flow freely. And that is a very different project from traditional language practice. It is a project of cultivating the right internal environment, of learning to regulate your nervous system, of building psychological safety in the context of English communication, of developing the kind of self-trust that allows you to speak without excessive self-monitoring, of learning, through repeated experience, that imperfect English in real communication is more valuable and more powerful than perfect English that stays locked inside a practice session. You have had them. Conversations where your English surprised you, where things came out that you did not know you could say, where the flow was smooth and the words arrived on time and you felt, for an extended moment, like a real English speaker, rather than someone doing their best to sound like one. Those conversations happened not because you suddenly became better at English. They happened because the conditions for your fluency state were met. The environment was safe, the person was warm, the topic was engaging, your body was relaxed, your self-monitoring was low, and in that space, the English you already had was free to move. Your job, and this is a significant reframe from how most learners think about their job, is not primarily to add more English to your brain. Your job is to create more conditions under which the English already in your brain can flow freely. And that is a very different project from traditional language practice. It is a project of cultivating the right internal environment, of learning to regulate your nervous system, of building psychological safety in the context of English communication, of developing the kind of self-trust that allows you to speak without excessive self-monitoring, of learning, through repeated experience, that imperfect English in real communication is more valuable and more powerful than perfect English that stays locked inside a practice session. Chapter 8. The real role of listening and speaking. Here is something that surprises most learners when they first hear it. The most powerful thing you can do to improve your speaking is not speaking practice. It is deep, focused, active listening. Not passive listening. Not listening while you do something else. Not listening so that you can understand the content of what is being said. Something different. Something that requires your full attention and operates on a level beneath the content. Let me explain what this kind of listening actually is. When you listen to a native speaker or a highly fluent speaker, there is the surface level, the words, the meaning, the information. Most learners listen at this level. They listen for comprehension. Did I understand what was said? Do I know all the words? Can I follow the argument? But underneath the surface, there is another level. There is the level of language music, the rhythm of the sentences, the stress patterns, which words are heavy and which are light, the melody of the voice, how it rises and falls across a sentence, how it signals emphasis or uncertainty or excitement or completion, the pacing, where the speaker slows down and where they accelerate. The pausing, not just when they pause, but why. The texture of the voice as it moves through different types of content. Narrative, explanation, argument, emotion. The way the body of the sentence relates to its ending. The way questions sound different from statements. The way implications are embedded in tone rather than stated in words. This is the music of the language, and you cannot speak a language musically, which is to say, naturally and fluently, until you have deeply absorbed its music through listening. Think about how this works with actual music. If you want to play jazz piano, You have to listen to enormous amounts of jazz, not because listening teaches you the technical mechanics of the piano, it does not, but because listening absorbs the jazz idiom into your musical mind. It fills you with phrases, with rhythms, with ways of moving through a chord progression that no amount of technical practice alone can give you. A jazz musician who has listened deeply to great jazz will improvise differently from one who has the same technical skills but has not done the deep listening. The listener will phrase more naturally, will swing more authentically, will know intuitively how to respond to what the other musicians are doing, because their ear is educated at a level below conscious thought. This is exactly what deep listening does for spoken language. It fills you with the rhythms, the cadences, the phrase shapes, the melodic patterns of the language at a level that your conscious mind cannot access, but that your production system uses automatically. When you have absorbed enough of the music of English, you do not need to consciously decide how to stress a sentence. You do not need to consciously choose where to pause or where to accelerate. These things emerge naturally because the music is inside you. Most learners are dramatically under-listening in this deep way. They are listening for comprehension, and comprehension listening is important. But it is not the same as this absorptive musical listening. Comprehension listening asks, do I understand this? Musical listening asks, am I absorbing the patterns at every level? Here is a practical way to understand the difference. Take a piece of spoken English, a podcast, a speech, an interview, a conversation that you can already understand fairly well. Now listen to it again, but this time do not listen for meaning. Listen for music. Listen to the rhythm of the sentences. Listen to where stress falls. Listen to how the voice moves. Try to follow the melody without paying attention to the words. Let the meaning go and just track the sound. This kind of listening is different in quality. It is more passive in one sense. You are not actively processing meaning, but it is also more receptive, more absorptive. Your brain is taking in patterns at a level beneath conscious analysis, and this is where the implicit system gets its material. There is another dimension of listening that directly improves speaking, and it operates not at the individual level, but at the relational level. It is the capacity to listen genuinely to the person you are speaking with. One of the great ironies of language anxiety is that it makes people listen less well. When you are anxious about how you sound, your attention is divided. Part of it is on the other person, but a large part is on yourself. You are monitoring your own language, thinking about what you are going to say next, worrying about whether you will be able to say it correctly. This self-monitoring competes with genuine listening, and the less genuinely you listen, the less connected the conversation feels. The less connected the conversation feels, the less safe you feel. The less safe you feel, the more anxious you become. The more anxious you become, the more you self-monitor, and the circle tightens. Breaking the circle requires deliberately shifting attention from yourself to the other person. This sounds simple. It is not, but it is possible. When you find yourself in a conversation where the anxiety is rising, the single most effective thing you can do is redirect your attention fully to what the other person is saying. Not to think about what you will say in response. Not to prepare your next sentence. Just to listen. Genuinely, fully, curiously listen. When you listen this way, several things happen. First, the self-monitoring quiets down. It cannot run at full volume when your attention is genuinely directed outward. Second, the conversation becomes more real. You are actually in it rather than watching yourself from the outside. Third, your responses become more natural because they emerge from genuine engagement rather than anxious preparation. Fourth, the other person feels heard, which creates warmth in the interaction, which makes the environment safer, which reduces your anxiety further. I want to give you a specific listening practice that has the power to transform your speaking ability at a pace that might surprise you. I am going to call it deep language immersion listening, and it has 3 layers. The first layer is what I described earlier, listening for music rather than meaning. You take a piece of authentic English audio, not simplified, not slowed down, not designed for language learners, a real podcast, a real interview, a real speech, a real conversation, and you listen to it 3 times. The first time, you listened for content and comprehension. You are getting the meaning. Standard listening. The second time, you turn the meaning off. You close your eyes and you listen to the audio as if it were music. You are not following the argument. You are following the sound. Where does the voice rise? Where does it fall? Where do sentences feel light and where do they feel heavy? Where does the speaker pause and for how long? And what does the pause communicate? You are training your ear at the level of the language's internal architecture. The third time, you listen and hum or murmur along with the rhythm. Not the words, the rhythm. This activates your own vocal production system at the level of melody and timing, which is where native-sounding speech actually begins. The second layer of deep language immersion listening is what I call attentive presence listening. This is a practice you do with people, not with audio recordings. When you are in a conversation in English, you practice giving the other person your complete, undivided, attentive presence. You are not planning your response. You are not monitoring your language. You are not thinking about what they will think of you. You are simply and fully present with what they are communicating, with the words, with the emotional tone beneath the words, with the thing they are really trying to tell you beyond the literal content. This level of attentive listening is rare. Most people, in most conversations, are partially listening and partially preparing their next contribution. When you offer someone genuinely full presence, they feel it. And the conversation becomes something different. It becomes warmer, more honest, more real. And in that warmth and reality, your own language production has far more space to breathe. The third layer is what I call strategic exposure listening. This is deliberately choosing to expose yourself to English in domains where you have strong existing knowledge and passion. If you are a doctor, listen to English medical podcasts. If you are an engineer, watch English engineering lectures. If you are passionate about philosophy, listen to English philosophers in conversation. The reason this is powerful is that your comprehension in these domains is supported by your existing conceptual knowledge, which means you can follow at a higher level of linguistic complexity than you could in an unfamiliar domain. Your brain is not working as hard to understand the content, so it has more resources available to absorb the language, the specific vocabulary, the disciplinary idioms, the characteristic sentence structures of that field. And because the content is genuinely interesting to you, you listen longer, more deeply, and with more genuine engagement, which means more absorption. Deep listening is not passive. It is an active, disciplined skill. It is the skill of being fully present with another person. And it is one of the most powerful tools available to the language learner, not because it directly teaches you English, but because it creates the relational conditions in which your English is free to emerge at its best. Chapter 9. Building a new relationship with mistakes. You are going to make mistakes in English for the rest of your life. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment before we go further. You are going to make mistakes in English for the rest of your life. Not because you are a slow learner, not because you have not studied hard enough, not because there is something wrong with you, but because you are a human being using a complex, living, endlessly nuanced language in real-time communication. And real-time communication with any human language in any context for any speaker at any level involves imperfection. Native speakers make mistakes every single day. They mispronounce words. They use the wrong idiom. They say something that comes out differently than they intended. They forget a word and substitute something approximate. They lose the structure of a long sentence and recover inelegantly. They use informal language in formal contexts. They use formal language in informal ones. The native speaker's relationship with these mistakes is different from yours. The native speaker makes the mistake, feels mildly annoyed or amused, and moves on. The mistake is a moment, not a crisis. It does not threaten their identity. It does not confirm a belief about their fundamental incompetence. It is just a thing that happened in the normal course of using a language like a human being. For many non-native speakers, mistakes carry a completely different weight. Each mistake is evidence of not being good enough, of not belonging, of the gap between who they are and who they wish they were in this language. Each mistake fires, on a small scale, the same social evaluation threat we talked about earlier. And the accumulated weight of all those fired threats, across years of learning, across thousands of mistakes, creates a deep, reflexive avoidance of situations where mistakes might be made. This avoidance is the most damaging thing that can happen to a language learner, because language is learned through use, and use involves mistakes. And avoiding mistakes means avoiding use, which means avoiding learning. The learner who is terrified of making mistakes uses less English, gets less exposure to real communication, builds fewer authentic connections through the language, and as a result improves more slowly than the learner who makes mistakes freely and keeps going. The relationship most learners have with mistakes needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, and rebuilding it does not start with affirmations or with being told that mistakes are okay. It starts with understanding what mistakes actually are. A mistake is information, nothing more and nothing less. When you say something incorrectly in English, and then, either in the moment or later, you become aware that it was incorrect, you have just received a precise piece of information about your current linguistic map. The map is slightly wrong here. The map needs updating at this location. This is valuable. This is exactly the kind of information your brain needs to refine its model of the language. When you avoid mistakes, you deprive your brain of this information. You keep your linguistic map frozen. You allow the wrong map to stay in place because you never go to the territory that would reveal its inaccuracy. And because you never update the map, you stay in the same place, wondering why you are not improving. Mistakes are not the enemy of learning. They are the fuel of learning. They are the mechanism through which the implicit system refines itself. Every mistake that you make, notice, and either self-correct or have corrected is a learning event at the deepest level. It is the implicit system saying, that prediction was wrong. Let me update the model. And that update, over time, moves you toward more accurate, more natural, more automatic language production. This is the scientific basis for what language researchers call the output hypothesis. The idea is that producing language, especially language that you push yourself to produce at the edge of your current ability, is one of the most powerful drivers of language acquisition. Not because producing language is inherently better than consuming it, but because production forces your system to check its own accuracy. Production reveals gaps in your competence that comprehension alone would never surface. You can understand a grammatical structure perfectly as a reader without being able to produce it correctly as a speaker. But when you try to produce it, the gap becomes visible, and visible gaps can be closed. Building a new relationship with mistakes means first changing what mistakes mean to you at the level of meaning making. And meaning making is, at its core, a choice, though it does not always feel like one. You get to decide what mistakes mean. You can decide they mean failure, incompetence, and evidence that you are not good enough. Or you can decide they mean progress, engagement with the real thing, and evidence that you are pushing past your current edge. One very useful reframe is this: in your native language, you do not make mistakes because you are using a map that is accurate to the territory. In English, you are still building the map. The mistakes are where the map is inaccurate, and every time you discover an inaccuracy, every time you make and notice a mistake, you improve the map. The mistakes are not a sign that the map is bad. They are a sign that you are actively mapping. The most fearless language learners in the world are children, and children are not fearless because they do not care about anything. They are fearless about language because they have not yet learned to attach identity to correctness. They say things wrong all the time, get corrected, and do not experience that correction as a threat to who they are. The correction is just information, and they update instantly and move on. Somewhere in the process of growing up, most people learn to attach identity to correctness. They learn that saying something wrong in front of others is embarrassing. That embarrassment carries social cost. That social cost is a threat. And the threat response fires, and the avoidance of mistakes begins. And language learning slows down. You cannot be a child again, but you can deliberately work to detach identity from correctness in the specific context of English communication. You can make a decision, a real, active, ongoing decision, that you are a person who speaks imperfect English with full confidence, not a person trying to speak perfect English, not a person apologizing for imperfect English, a person who claims the right to express themselves in this language fully and freely, knowing that the expression will be imperfect and that the imperfection is normal and acceptable and not a reflection of your intelligence, your education, your character, or your worth. When you make that decision and begin to live inside it, your relationship with mistakes shifts. They do not disappear, but they lose their power to freeze you. And when mistakes lose their power to freeze you, you speak more. And when you speak more, you improve faster. And when you improve faster, you make fewer mistakes of certain kinds. And you develop gradually the kind of fluency that is not fragile, the kind that holds up in the real world, under real pressure, with real people. Chapter 10. The Shift That Changes. Everything we have covered a lot of ground together. We have looked at why more practice is not the answer. We have looked at what your brain is actually doing when you try to speak. We have looked at the difference between drilling and real speaking. We have looked at the freeze and what causes it. We have looked at the identity problem, the two selves and the gap between them. We have looked at how to rewire your English mind. We have looked at fluency as a state rather than a skill. We have looked at the real role of listening, and we have looked at what it means to build a new relationship with mistakes. Now, I want to bring it all together into the shift itself. The one fundamental shift that everything in this video has been pointing toward. The shift that, if you actually make it, not intellectually, not as an idea you agree with, but as a lived, embodied daily reality, will change your experience of English forever. The shift is this: stop approaching English as a subject and start inhabiting it as a world. I want to unpack that carefully because it is not a metaphor. It is a description of two genuinely different relationships to a language, and they produce completely different results. When you approach English as a subject, you are a student in relation to a body of knowledge. The body of knowledge is out there, in textbooks, in courses, in correct sentences, in native speaker usage. You are in here, studying it, trying to absorb it, trying to approximate it. The knowledge is the standard, and you are trying to meet it. You are always on the outside looking in. This position, outside looking in, is the source of most of the psychological problems we have discussed. The freeze, the identity gap, the excessive self-monitoring, the mistake terror, the performance anxiety. All of these things flow from the experience of being outside something, trying to get in. When you are outside, you are always aware of the wall, always aware of the gap between where you are and where the standard is, always measuring yourself against something external. When you inhabit English as a world, everything changes. You are inside the language. The language is the medium through which you think, express, perceive, and relate. You are not trying to reach a standard. You are living in a territory and navigating it as it actually is, imperfectly, organically, with the specific vocabulary and structures and habits you have developed so far, knowing that the territory will continue to expand as you explore it. This shift from outside to inside is the fundamental shift. Everything else, the rewiring of the mind, the regulation of the threat response, the reconstruction of identity, the building of a new relationship with mistakes, everything else is in service of this shift. They are all ways of helping you move from the outside position to the inside position. Let me tell you what inhabiting English looks like in practice, not as an abstract ideal, but as a set of concrete daily realities. Inhabiting English looks like waking up in the morning and having your first thoughts in English, not translating your morning thoughts, having them in English. Even if they are fragmentary, even if they are simple, even if they switch to your native language halfway through. Gently, without force, letting the day begin in the language. Inhabiting English looks like consuming English media, not as a learning exercise, but as genuine entertainment or genuine intellectual engagement. Reading an English article because you actually care about the topic, not because you are trying to improve your vocabulary. Watching an English documentary because you genuinely want to know what it is about. Not because it is good language practice. Listening to an English podcast because the conversation interests you, not because you are practicing your listening skills. Inhabiting English looks like having thoughts in English about things that matter to you. When you are walking down the street and you notice something beautiful or strange or funny, noticing it in English. When you are working through a problem, working through it in English. When you are feeling something, frustration, joy, grief, excitement. Feeling it in English first, before the translation to your native tongue. This is not about abandoning your native language. Your native language is not your enemy. It is your home. But English can also become a home, not the same kind of home and not at the expense of the first one, but a real home nonetheless. A place where you belong, where you are not a visitor, where you do not need to ask permission to speak. Inhabiting English looks like speaking it not when you have something perfectly formed to say, but when you have something you want to say. Releasing the requirement that the sentence be correct before it comes out. Letting the imperfect sentence emerge and carrying the conversation forward from there. Treating the imperfect sentence not as a failure, but as the natural product of a real person engaging genuinely with a real moment. Inhabiting English looks like bringing your full personality into English. Your humor, your sarcasm, your philosophical side, your emotional depth, your opinions, your stories. Not simplifying yourself to fit the language you have, but stretching the language to fit who you are. Yes. This will require finding new words, new structures, new ways of expression. But the search for those words, the active, engaged, motivated search for how to say what you actually mean, is one of the most powerful acquisition experiences available to you. Language learned in the pursuit of something you genuinely need to express stays with you in a way that drilled language never does. Inhabiting English looks like forgiving yourself, repeatedly, consistently, not as a one-time decision, but as an ongoing practice. Every time the self-monitoring voice gets loud, every time you catch yourself apologizing for your accent, every time you feel the freeze coming, every time you walk away from a conversation feeling like you failed, forgiving yourself, returning to the language, returning to the attempt. Not because you are forcing positivity, but because you understand that this is what the process actually looks like, and you are willing to be inside it for the long term. And inhabiting English looks like caring more about connection than correctness. This is perhaps the most transformative single shift within the shift. Connection over correctness. When you prioritize connection, genuinely reaching the other person, genuinely exchanging meaning, genuinely being present in the conversation, correctness becomes a servant of that goal rather than an obstacle to it. You speak in service of the connection. The language is the bridge, not the destination. And bridges do not need to be perfect to carry you across. I want to say something directly to you before we close. Something that I want you to hear not as encouragement, but as the honest conclusion of everything we have talked about today. You already have more English than you think you do. You are more ready than you feel. The gap between where you are and where you want to be is smaller than your anxiety makes it seem, and the path across it does not run through more practice sessions. It runs through a deeper, more honest, more courageous relationship with the language and with yourself. The speakers you admire, the ones who make it look effortless, whose English flows naturally, who seem to think and feel and joke and argue in English as naturally as breathing. They got there not by being more talented than you or by practicing more hours than you. They got there by crossing the line from studying the language to living inside it, by making English not a subject but a self, by deciding at some point consciously or unconsciously that this language was theirs to use, to claim, to make their own. That decision is available to you, right now, today, not as a future reward for enough practice, not as a destination you reach after enough years of study, as a decision, a shift in how you hold the language, a shift in how you hold yourself in relation to it. You do not need more practice. You need this shift. And now I want to come back to the question I asked you at the beginning of this video. I asked you to find the one thing that practice cannot give you, but that fluent speakers have in abundance. I hope that by now, after everything we have explored together, you know the answer. And the answer is this: belonging. Fluent speakers belong inside the language. They are not visitors trying to pass as residents. They are not students approximating a standard. They have, in whatever way and over whatever time, made the language their home. And belonging, genuine, felt, embodied belonging, is something no amount of practice can manufacture. It can only be chosen and then lived. And then, over time, deepened into something that feels as natural and as permanent as the native tongue you have always known. Write that word in the comments. Belonging. And then tell me, where are you right now in your own relationship with English? Are you on the outside looking in? Or have you started to step inside? What is the one thing this video shifted for you today? I want to read your answers. I want to know where you are. Because this channel exists for one purpose, to walk with you from the outside to the inside, from studying the language to living inside it, from doing your best to speak English to speaking English as yourself. This is the Speaking Reset, and this is where the real work begins. If this video spoke to something real in you, not just to your study habit, but to something deeper, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is working hard and not breaking through. Someone who is stuck, not because they are not trying, but because they are trying the wrong thing. This message might be exactly what they need. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Because there is much more where this came from. And every single video we make is built to bring you one step deeper into the language. One step closer to the speaker, you already are beneath the anxiety and the self-monitoring and the years of being told that you just need to practice more. You do not need more practice. You need this shift, and you have already started making it. See you in the next one.